to the first of our debates, which is entitled Projecting the Future of Policing. So what does the future hold, especially after £3.5 billion of cuts and the loss of 35,000 officers and staff? How should the force be funded in the future? Should more resources and staff staff services be shared, perhaps? How can you cope with austerity measures, for example, while at the same time maintaining frontline services and indeed the all-important public trust? We have two speakers for you this afternoon, and just a reminder that at the end of their speeches, we are inviting questions. The first speaker today will be Zoe Billingham from HMIC, who, as many of you will know, was a member of the National Debate Advisory Group, and alongside her we've got Chris Eyre, who is of course the Chief Constable of Nottingham. Would you welcome them both to the platform? Come and take your seats here, Zoe and Chris. And I think Zoe's going to talk first. Thank you very much.
Afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. In fact, I'm really delighted to be here amongst such an august and experienced group of senior police leaders. I know, because I'm out inspecting you week in, week out, and it must feel like that for you, that you are absolutely at the sharp end of all of the changes and the cost reductions that have happened over the last 4 years, and you're also utterly imperative to the success. It's not often that HMIC congratulates people. Sometimes it hurts to do this. But look, here we are. This is the reality. What's happened over the last 4 years has been unprecedented in terms of policing. When we published our last report on value for money, which was a year ago now, I said these words, and I wanted to put them up to start the conversation about the challenge moving forwards. The service is to be congratulated. What you've achieved over the last 4 years is pretty astonishing. You're holding up the level of service to the public in most places. You're continuing to provide innovation to the public. You're continuing to change and to meet the varying challenges that we all know about, the hidden demand, the changes in crime. You've taken £2.5 billion out over the last 4 years, and the service should be proud of those achievements. Needless to say, whenever we publish a report that is extremely positive, we have a kind of an inverse, disproportionate amount of coverage from the media. But this is what we said at the time that we launched that report, and we should hold on to that. I'm going to talk about the national debate, which was the work that we've done over the last 6 to 12 months to talk about how policing needs to change in order to be able to continue to adapt to ongoing austerity. But I am going to very briefly recap on what's been achieved. I think it's important that we do so. I'm going to hand over to Chris then, and he's going to do the vision thing. So I'm doing the boring introduction, the setting the scene. Chris is going to do the visions thing. I have to say I feel slightly uncomfortable about being a warm-up act for a chief constable. I normally get to have the last word. I was going to say last laugh, but as my son would say, that is wrong on so many levels. Okay, what has been achieved? Well, John has almost stolen my thunder already. Thank you very much. And he's also going to keep me to time. But a heck of a lot of money has already been taken out of policing. How that's impacted on individual forces depends who your force is. But effectively, police national grant has reduced by 20% over the 4 years. That has manifested itself in over 16,000 fewer police officers. Taken together, we've got 34,400 fewer police officers, staff and PCSOs. 8,500 fewer police officers on the front line. And that is having an impact, as you know, in your ability to be able to police the areas you're responsible for. We know that reported crime is down, but we also know, particularly from the work of the College of Policing, that demand is growing in an enormous number of other ways. I think it would be helpful for the service to get a better handle on what we really mean by this when we talk about growing demand. I think some of the metrics around this could certainly be improved. And we know what the future challenge is. It was in the Chancellor's announcement over the summer. and that is that unprotected departments are going to have to find between 25 and 40% or develop saving plans to be able to take out that amount over the next spending review period. Clearly, we don't know yet what that means for policing, but we do know that the Home Office is an unprotected department. So the scale of the challenge has been significant, but the way that the cuts have fallen over the first 4 years has been very different. And I think that's one of the things that's been most stark, certainly for me, who's up until fairly recently been responsible for looking at value for money on behalf of HMIC, is the differential challenge. None of the challenge has been easy, don't get me wrong. Taking 10% out has been tough for some forces that have had to do that. And this is a graph showing the amount of savings as a proportion of gross revenue expenditure. It's kind of the proportion of savings you've had to find based on your base budget. So some forces at one end, sort of North Yorkshire, North Wales, South Wales, have had to find sort of lower, sort of 10, 12, 15%. And forces at the top end of the graph, the Warwickshires, Northumbrias and the Met Police have been having to find up to 28% of overall revenue expenditure. Of course, that's a heck of a lot. Why is there this differential challenge? Well, I don't need to tell you. This is based on historic funding arrangements, police authority precepting decisions, remember them? And that's led to huge differentiation in the amount of funding that comes from the local as opposed to the national. And the more that you have funded through the national, through the police grant, the more that 20% reduction in that grant is going to, by and large, impact on you as a force. So some forces, Northumbria, for example, has up to 90% of its funding coming through the local route, the precept, whereas Surrey, on the other hand, has got something like 50% of its funding coming through precept. I think I probably messed that up a bit. I probably meant it the other way round. But I've got some knowing nods and just ignore, smile, wave on. She's talking about figures. Let's do a bit of tweeting. Let me talk a bit about something that's closer to home for you. I have no joy in putting up this slide. But it tells a stark story for the way that the challenge has fallen differentially across different ranks. I won't mention it, Chris, too many times, but chief officers have seen a 10% reduction in their numbers compared to a 23% reduction in the superintending ranks. That's a very significant difference. And I know, because I make a point of talking to Superintendents Association on the inspections that I do. I also pay a lot of attention, by the way, to the welfare surveys that you've done, incredibly valuable from my perspective. I know that this is putting a huge stress and strain on you as individuals, really challenging your leadership skills, capabilities and capacities, and I'm sure that that's an ongoing conversation that you have within the association. We said a year ago that policing should plan to find the same scale of savings over the coming spending review period as the last. That wasn't prejudging government policy by any means, but it was simply looking at all of the runes, if you like, that were written in the sand. And basically, HMIC felt it important to send a message to the service that this ain't going to get any better, and I think you all knew that anyway, but we felt that we should say that. We said quite clearly as an inspectorate that continuing to reduce costs in the same way over the next 4 years as we have in the last 4 years is not an option. It will place the viability of some forces we saw from our inspection work in jeopardy in 3 to 5 years' time, not least because some forces are already having to cut very hard and very deep into neighbourhood policing. We said that more savings are achievable, but there needs to be reform in the way that the service is organised and funded. Hence the national debate, led by the advisory group of which Eyre and Gavin were very esteemed members, as well as all of the other usual suspects, Fed Unison, MPCC, APCC, College of Policing. What was interesting in the debate, and it was held over a series of events nationally, was a degree of consensus amongst the service, and in particular amongst the leaders within the service, of the need to change. What was less clear is how that change needs to happen and precisely what that change should look at. The debate was aimed to simply stimulate debate. It wasn't to provide policing with a blueprint, and we certainly didn't get anywhere near a blueprint for what the future of policing looked like, but we came up with a number of ideas. We felt that a good starting point within this piece of work was to restate what the principal mission of policing is. We came up with 5 principles. I would have a look at these if you've not had an opportunity to do so. There is nothing new here, but I think it's really helpful to build a new structure of policing around the function on which we are all operating. We felt it was really important as an advisory group that we should focus on the importance of prevention and early action rather than the response reactive end of policing, however important that is. It's absolutely vital that we maintain that early action, early intervention, prevention, presence in policing, however that may be achieved. The service must be provided and tailored to meet the victim's needs, particularly the vulnerable. We must protect access to the front line, whether that's visible or the online policing presence. I think that's quite a contentious one. What can we reasonably expect in terms of visible policing moving forwards? I have a very personal view on that. We must achieve value for money by scaling up specialist capabilities and standardising nationally across all forces. And we really need to move ahead in what Chris is about to talk about in terms of partnership, proper partnership integration. Let me just pause on that. When we're talking about a new framework, what we're talking about is not talking to partners. It's about doing absolutely everything possible that we can jointly, so that when we ask ourselves the question, are we preventing crime and keeping people safe through maximising joint endeavour, we can all say hand on heart, yes. Now I'm just going to ask for a quick show of hands. This is always dangerous. You may have already fallen asleep. But genuinely, are you, through the work that you are doing in your force, absolutely maximising the joint endeavour? Or is there further that you would like to go? Maybe not in your gift, but is there more that you would like to do through that joint partnership working in your local areas? Please put your hands up if you think that you are maximising the endeavour of the force and the partners now. Right, okay, I just better make sure you are not nodding off. So could you just put your hands up if you think we're not maximising that endeavour? Okay, that's really easy for me to ask that question, but it's very, very difficult to answer how you move from where you are now to where you need to get to. That's why Chris is on next, and he's going to answer that for you. The bit that was a real rub in the debate was when we started to try to put bits of the building block of policing into what actually could and should only be provided at a local level, what could and should only be provided regionally, or as we describe in the report, cross-force, and what should be national. There was quite a lot of consensus about the principal elements of what should be local. What's much more contentious, though, is what should and only be provided once regionally, particularly across operational support, contact management, intelligence, CJ, forensics and business support. But even when you get into those areas where there is a kind of an acceptance, police, particularly around serious organised crime, is how much should individual forces let go of and only have provided through access through a regional cross-force unit, whatever that looks like. But the luxury of each of us having in 43 forces a suite of capabilities, specialist capabilities in every force, that's gone. Those days are over. And I think all of us in this room probably accept that. So, what are the enablers and imperatives for change? Am I doing all right, John? Because this is my last slide. 5 minutes. Wow, 3 minutes. I was going to say I can really draw this one out, but I won't because Chris has got far more to say. This is not being facetious. What do we need for change? We need a plan. We came up with some ideas in the National Debate Advisory Group, no more than that. We didn't come up with ways and means of making those ideas happen, and that's down to you, those of you in this room who want to see the service change and recognise that it has to change, and I think that's 100% of you. And a plan that's supported by police leaders, by the service more generally, by the Home Office, by all the people working in policing, by the inspectorate. There needs to be a clear statement of where we are now and where we need to get to in order to afford this change, give it the opportunity to happen. That requires strong leadership. We do need to have the debate. It's been taking place over the summer about what that mission of policing is, what must be preserved, what can we no longer do, and do we within the service, I think it's simply me posing a question, do we have the ability to say no? What does the partnership and devolution debate mean? You know, we hear about the cities and local government devolution process. I think for some forces it's very clear what that may and could mean in terms of policing. But for other forces I think it's very indistinct. And I think we need to have a conversation at differential levels, because if you're in one of those kind of cities, devolved areas, that's going to mean one thing. If you're in those forces that fringe that geographical location, it's going to mean something very, very different indeed. Where are the financial freedoms and flexibilities necessary to incentivise the changes that we want to see happen within policing? Where is the debate happening as to whether or not PCCs need to have greater freedom to be able to increase the precept, for example? Where is the conversation being had as to whether or not there are certain channels of funding that ought to be put in a particular place to ensure that the service is only having access to specialist capabilities once rather than 43 times? There's some really, really difficult, tough decisions that need to be made if we're going to use the financial freedoms and incentives as a mechanism and as a lever through which to encourage, incentivise change. And last but not least, easy for me to say, now much more difficult again to deliver. We need rapid action. We said in the National Debate Advisory Group report that there needs to be some fairly well-rounded proposals for change ready for discussion as part of this spending review deliberation. That means we've got weeks, perhaps a few months, but certainly not years, in which we as a service come together collectively and put some meat onto the bones of what was the work of the National Debate Advisory Group. Handing over to Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you. As the only person in the room who didn't read about the dress code and turned up in uniform today, I hope you forgive me. I will try and keep on track as we go through the next part. What I want to try and do is talk to you about where I think, and this is very much a personal reflection, the future of policing needs to be able to deal with both the operational challenges we face, the opportunities we face, and the financial environment that we're operating in. It is a personal reflection. I don't purport to represent the views of NPCC or anybody else in this. Some of the things I may say later may be a bit unpopular within the service, but frankly, this is a time when, as leaders, we have to step forward and start facing some really difficult issues that we have to lead on and make sure that the police service that's received by the public meets their needs and be slightly less introspective and focusing in on ourselves. When I first went to Nottinghamshire in 2010, thank you, Zoe, when I was asked to go and work in Nottinghamshire, the vision for what I wanted to see us do as a force was very simple. It was very clear at that stage that we were not going to survive in the next round of what was going to come in terms of austerity as we were as a force. The financial environment was pretty clear, and it was pretty clear it was going to exist for at least 6 or 7 years and potentially longer. So the potential around this was, my position from Nottinghamshire was a simple hourglass strategy. Anything that's specialist, push it up. Get it collaborated with, deliver it with others, force out the efficiencies and make sure it works most effectively on behalf of the public that we're trying to protect. So maximise the operational effectiveness and deliver as much efficiency as possible. Anything that's about a very local service, release and push down. Empower people who are delivering at a local level, empower local commanders, and more importantly, build and integrate a service that makes sense to the service user and isn't defined solely by the organisation that's delivering it. Because far too much of what we were doing at that stage was based upon our identity as an organisation and our service that we delivered through our own silos. Move forward 5 years, and where are we at the moment from a Nottinghamshire perspective? Well, if you step into the top of the hourglass, the stuff that we tried to push up and deliver collaboratively with other organisations to maximise the efficiency, we have the following. These are delivered through MSU at a 5-force level. Every single debate you will have been having in your organisation about we can't let go because they won't be able to do it better or as well as or anywhere near the way that we've done it took place in the East Midlands around these services. It has been delivered. They work far better than the things that we had before. But part of the leadership challenge is to let go, trust and empower really capable leaders to deliver the collaborative challenge. That's delivered on a 5-force basis. Where we haven't been able to get 5 forces together, we haven't walked away and said it can't be done, therefore. The following set that you see are delivered on a 4-force basis. So we have 4 forces that are committed, and they're delivered consistently and effectively across the 4 forces. That means you have to manage risk in the round. You have to give and take. You can't expect to win on everything. You've got to be prepared to compromise and make things work. But it works, and it works at least as well, if not better, than the precursor services. It's delivered something like a 22% efficiency saving over the cost of the precursor parts of the organisation. And where we haven't got agreement of being able to go forward on a 4-force basis, we have a 2-force collaboration that's looking at all of the corporate services and back office functions and saying, we can do this collaboratively and differently, taking the challenge that Robert put down earlier. You don't need to do it all ourselves. I could outsource this and get it delivered from an industry. I don't need it to be done internally. What worries me to an extent when you look at this, the really high-risk end of policing, we've actually bit the bullet and done it. When we start to step into the key operational areas, we've bitten the bullet and done it. Yet when it comes to the corporate part of the organisation, which carries less risk to the public, we haven't yet made those steps to the extent that we need to. And Robert, in his presentation earlier, talked really clearly about the fact we need to be clear about our business processes, map and deliver things consistently. We cannot afford to do that 43 times over. The only way that's going to work is if we start to commit to clear business processes that deliver in the public interest, and we do it in a rational and effective way. It means we've got to be prepared to compromise in these ways. At the bottom of the hourglass, pushing down and into our communities to deliver differently was about starting to shape services to deliver for us. This just happens to be the command structure for the division in our city, which is the biggest part of demand and probably the most complex communities for us to deal with in Nottinghamshire. That command structure fits very clearly in a position where everything that we deliver around a very local place-based service is delivered with our partners in the City Council. And the integrated management structure means that the divisional commander line manages the Director of Community Safety, who line manages inspectors, chief inspectors, who line manage all of these functions. It is a single integrated delivery structure that brings things together and enables us to manage the service delivery based about the local need and the local area in the interest of the community, not simply based upon the identity of the organisation that's delivering it. We're now in a process where we're looking to take that to the next level of delivery. And you may have seen in some of the police media, they talk about a strategic alliance between Nottinghamshire, Northamptonshire and Leicestershire. This is simply an expression about where we are at the moment in the conversation. It's not a definition about exactly what the strategic alliance may look like, and necessarily it will be different from the strategic alliance that exists in Warwickshire and West Mercia, because all that's gone on before gives us a very different starting point. But with 3 police and crime commissioners, we're told we need to have 3 chief constables. We have 3 deputy chief constables, but we can align our operational services in a different way and potentially around these kind of functions. So we could end up in a position where we have 3 chief constables, 3 deputy chief constables, and 3 or 4 ACCs or assistant chief officers. It feels top-heavy. It feels inefficient. The bureaucracy in it is unhelpful. In addition to which, we have the complexity that we have to deliver in that partnership environment at a local level in ways that things will deliver differently around our other partner services. So what may be possible in Northamptonshire around fire and rescue may not be possible in a permissive environment in Nottinghamshire because the fire authority is in a different position, or in Leicestershire because the fire authority is in a different position. Similarly, if you look at where we are around safeguarding, local authority appetites and expectations are different in each location. Partnership services are necessarily shaped differently. And our other partners are working in different ways. So how we bring the strategic alliance together and make that work is going to be a difficult journey, but it's the right thing to do to rationalise what we do and make sure the resources we have focus down and into our communities to make as much difference as we possibly can. All of this around a strategic alliance has to operate in the context of all the work that's going on in a 4 and 5 force collaborative basis. it does at times make governance quite difficult and confusing. Because you may have a 3-force capability that's operating with a 4-force context and support in one respect, supported by a 5-force capability in another way. It would be far simpler if there was a single, clear, coherent delivery structure that brought it together, with a clear vision that said this is how we're all going to work and deliver together. But we constantly, as you will have found over the last 5 years, been worked on a basis where we move forward step by incremental step, addressing and changing slowly and moving more and more closely towards an alignment without ever making a statement at the outset that that's where we were going to. The complexity of collaboration becomes more difficult in the context of what I was describing, the downward part of making the bottom end of the hourglass work effectively, is that everything that we're doing there is designed to be delivered in one way, in a joined-up way, through partners. The really important part of this is we know that when we put operational people in teams together from different organisations, they deliver in spades. Once you remove the organisational guff, the bureaucracy, the barriers, the regulation that says you can't, good operational teams brought together deliver brilliantly and do it in spades. But we have to find a way through navigating through different organisational structures with different geographic boundaries, different governance accountabilities, and different processes. We've got to find a way in all of this, whether it be the complexity of the health economy, the introduction of combined authorities and what that may mean, the differing local authority structures between two-tier and unitary authority structures, whatever. The organisational architectures are different, and it makes it complex. Part of our vision for a public service of the future has to be something that brings together coherence and simplicity, that makes sense to the public, and will allow us to deliver a high-quality service in the most effective way. Less focused upon us and our identity, and focused very clearly on the service user, the member of the public, the community, and what they need. So, as we move on, the vision of Aurora, so Aurora is the work that we do in the city. What we got to so far in terms of Aurora and its delivery in July, which was the last slide that's up, now moves on to the vision of Aurora 2018. We're hoping to take, or in planning to take, the delivery of our local place-based services to an entirely different level of integration. Without going through in detail, all of the organisational structures around the outside, coordinated through a single point of access of service, to make sure that when the public get in touch with a single point of access, single assessment of safety and need, placing the right resources in the right place to deliver against the local community and what the local community needs. Making sure that we're focusing on what we need to do in the short term around immediate response, being very clear about our focus is to prevent long-term demand and need in communities, and that's against the context of all of the expectations and needs of communities, and making sure we're building long-term protection for the safety of those communities as well. If that's the journey that we've been on to bring policing together and deliver the hourglass, the change that we've seen since the Chancellor's statement earlier this summer has been putting in place a different context for us. The financial environment has changed for us, and we have to do as Zoe says, and step up and start to lead a solution now that will deliver in the context of very significant financial challenges and make sure it works for the future. It has to be sufficient to deal not just with the challenge of reaching forward for 2020, but we've got to be thinking of the vision of policing that will take us forward as far as 2030, because the scale of change we're going to go through is so significant, we've got to be prepared to think beyond austerity into reshaping service. You'll know the work that we have around demand. Okay, of the demand that we know, and we've been through all the work that's looked at what takes place, and the College of Policing's work has been instrumental in what demand looks like, we know that there are differing levels of demand on our officers that go beyond crime. But how much of this is what we should be focusing on, and where should we focus our effort in the future to make sure that with however much less resource we've got, we're using it most effectively to protect the public? I'll skip over this because Zoe's already covered it in great detail. But the position we start from as we step into the next round of cuts is very different. How do we make sure, as we go through the differing positions in terms of austerity, that we end up with a coherent service that makes sense to the public and delivers a consistent level of high-quality service, so we don't end up with something that makes it completely differentiated around the country? Zoe's been through this, so I'll skip over very quickly. We know where the future is. I have seen so much in the media and so much conversation within policing around the scale of the challenge, and they don't understand. Okay, let's wake up and recognise the decisions that are being made in a very conscious way. We have a government that's legitimately elected and has come forward with a position around austerity and what it intends to do. A conscious decision has been made about which budgets will be protected and which aren't. In making that conscious decision, people who've done it aren't stupid. They will have looked at and seen the scale of challenge it will present us. And in the context of where we've seen 25% reductions and more in crime over the last few years, a conscious decision has been made to say, this is where we are. So when we're standing around, and I've seen a lot of the media in the last week while I've been on holiday, has been talking about the fact, do they realise that we'll be losing these posts? I'm absolutely certain that in the key departments in government, they are aware of the scale of the challenge we're facing. What they expect us to do is to stand forward and lead our way through it. We are the leaders of the police service. Our job is now to look at the scale of the challenge we're facing, because with a £3.5 billion potential additional cut to grant, okay, that's going to leave us with about £8 billion being spent in policing each year. Right, let's stop crying about we've got a difficult challenge to face, and let's start thinking about what does a service look like that invests £8 billion a year in the policing service and the safety services for our communities. Let's be ambitious and start to think about how we shape and deliver things differently to make sure it's the most effective and efficient way we can spend it. So he's touched on some of this as well. The context that we're operating in isn't static. It's not simply that we've got a little bit of demand and we've got to find a way of coping with it. The whole expectation of our communities is changing around us. Robert's presentation earlier talked about a whole different way in which our society works. It's not just about finding the savings. It's about reshaping our service to make sure we're relevant and effective to meet the needs of our communities. We know there's a big pressure around public protection. This is from another force in the East Midlands whose recent work was looking at it and saying, if they were to do everything they're expected around public protection, you could be looking at putting another 4% of the force budget in dealing with that. Okay, we need to understand what is the legitimate expectation, what level of service must we offer, and how do we make sure we get it right? If you look at the work around the Goddard inquiry and the work around Operation Hydrant, we have historical abuse that we must step into and make sure we deal in a legitimate and credible way so the public has confidence that these serious crimes are dealt with effectively. Cybercrime was implicit in some of the stuff that was addressed earlier. If you look at where we are around cybercrime, we know that the whole context is changing around the nature of how crime and offending is taking place. And we know that if you start to look at the conversation we've had around crime reduction, we know in the background the nature of crime has changed significantly. Offences that used to take place in the offline world are now taking place in terms of fraud in an online way that simply aren't being picked up and recorded in the national crime statistics. We've got to find a way of responding to that, because we will find out in the ONS, from the ONS and from the Crime Survey of England and Wales, when they publish the next round of data, that there are millions of unrecorded offences in this space that we've got to find a way of dealing with more effectively. So do we face a position then that with budgets cut differentially, that we start to look at the different levels of service that we provide in different parts of what we do and start to say, actually, we provide a gold level of service on some of these, but we've got to start using a much more differentiated way and understanding what a satisfactory, adequate level of resource and service is in other areas. So we get it right and deliver the right level of service rather than trying to aim or be expected to deliver a gold standard service in everything. Does that mean we end up in a position where we have to accept and acknowledge, with the different resourcing levels people start from, that we end up with different levels of service being delivered in different locations? Or do we need to be having a conversation around the quality of service and how we deliver to make sure that the public receive a consistent level of service in different areas and different aspects of what we do across the country in all communities? I said before there's a leadership challenge for us. I don't think we can be passive. We can't simply sit back and say, government tell us what to do. We are selected, appointed, and required to lead. That's our role. You're absolutely right. The challenge for us as leaders in the police service, one of the things that was mentioned by Zoe earlier, and I've been banging away for 5 years saying we've got to rationalise the number of chief officer structures across the country because it makes sense to do so. We can't keep going through a process and start talking and saying, I'm all right, Jack, it's okay for me. The people next door I don't care about. Because I care about the policing in all of our communities, and I don't think it's a consistent or effective position for us to take where we say, providing it's okay in my space, if the communities over here don't get an effective service in the future, not down to me. Our role is to design a service for the future which makes sure all communities are safe, and we have an obligation as a leadership group to do that. I also share Zoe's point is it's untenable to be in a position where 10% of chief officers of reduction since 2010, 10% reduction in PCs in that same period, 27% reduction in superintending ranks. That's untenable. Okay. I think we've got to be in a clear position as well. We start to design our service based upon threats, harms, and risks. We still have a culture which is about compliance with doctrine that was written a decade ago in a completely different resource environment. We need to understand how we manage threat, harm, and risk, and many of you will be doing it through the OBB process. We're looking and providing a different kind of solution. I also think we've got to step forward into a challenge that we face as well. When you look at the scale of the financial environment facing us, I don't think we can afford to be in a position where we simply stand up and say, I'm afraid we're going to have to make all of the police staff in this organisation redundant because that's how I'm going to balance my budget and I'm going to protect all the police officers, potentially taking away very effective police staff in order that we can move police officers who cost more into the roles and then have to train them to deliver it, possibly not as effectively as their police staff colleagues. That kind of apartheid position that's existed in policing for too long is unsustainable. I think we've got to have a voice about what kind of workforce we need for the future and what that means for the public, based upon the service the public need, not about our own vested self-interests. It means we've got to be prepared to challenge ourselves, and I personally think we've got to be in a position where if we reduce headcount, it must be reducing headcount in a way that makes sure we have the right shape of service for the future, not just protecting the number of police officers we employ. And that probably means the issue of redundancy for police officers. We also need to know, and this is very much a matter for the public, what's the public's position in terms of the service they want from us for the future? What do they want from policing? For the government, I think there's a question here, and it is very much an issue for the government. It shouldn't be for the service to turn around and say, we know best, this is just what you're going to get from us. We need to engage in a conversation through government about what are the priorities, what are the expectations, what is the service that the public needs of policing with 50% less resource, at least since 2010. We've got to make sure that we've got a structure of public service which is focused on communities, and anything that can be done to simplify the bureaucratic architecture we have to make sure it works better in the public interest has got to be in everybody's interests. And I guess there's a question as well is, given the different resources that we have and given the cuts that are different in the way that Zoe set out, do we need to start publicly acknowledging that in the context of that, in an organisation that's faced a 23% cut, you may receive a different level of service than an organisation that's faced a 12% cut. So our challenge for us collectively is the vision for 2030 is what kind of public service do we want for our communities? And where does policing fit within that to make sure it works most effectively? Thank you.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, plenty to chew on there. We've got I have four helpers with microphones scattered around the room, so they'll make themselves available to you. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment on what's been said by either Zoe or Chris, just stick your hand up right now. One of my assistants will come right to you. Can I just, while they're gathering themselves, ask you one question? Well, you both one question. It's a pretty obvious one, really. I'll kick off with you, Zoe, because we're going to let Chris catch his breath. I mean, you're both talking about the need for action. You're both talking about the need for a great debate, etc., and to formulate your plans. Haven't you left it a bit late? I mean, the spending review's in November.
Possibly, yeah. It was July 2014 when we said that there needs to be a debate, it needs to happen, and the service needs to come forward with ideas for change, for transformation, radical or basic. We are where we are. I think what's been really important through the debate process is that the policing service as a service has had a conversation with itself and come up with a range of options, although not fully worked through, that will assist in any deliberations around the spending review. In an ideal world, we should have those options better worked up and a more rounded package to be able to put forward as a potential way forward. I think we have to run with what we've got and not simply walk away and say, well, actually, it's too late. We have to, as leaders, stand up and make sure that those voices through the debate are expressed and heard.
But if George Osborne, Chris, says in November, right, say, let's go halfway down, between 25 and 40%, let's say it's 33%, whatever it is, cuts for the police service generally across the country, what are you going to say?
I think you'll find in every force in the country, certainly in the forces that I work most closely with every day, there are teams already working on their plans about how they would deliver against the options we've been asked to consider. The risk we face is that each force makes slightly different decisions and ends up with divergent decision-making. It's not often you find a Chief Constable defending HMI, but I'll do it. Since 2010, Zoe has been challenging the police service to step forward with a coherent position around what we deliver in an effective, joined-up way and how we manage it more consistently. The challenge has been there consistently. We in the service have in different ways engaged, sometimes because of the need. Forces have felt they haven't needed to, we haven't done so. But the challenge has been there very consistently from HMIC since 2010 to have a clear position looking at the long term. I wish we had taken some of the decisions I think we need to make earlier, but we are where we are. And given that we are where we are, we now need to behave in a consistent and coherent way and start focusing on a sustained position. John, I would find it untenable to be in a position where we end up in a bidder's auction where Force X reaches a point of being unsustainable, and Force Y that's next door...
We've been pretty close to that, according to one Chief Constable, haven't we?
Force Y next door says, do you know what? I don't need to worry about you because I'm all right because I'm collaborating with somebody else.
Two-tier police force.
I think what we need to be clear about is what is our commitment around the service to our communities, and how do we ensure that we brigade that £8 billion most effectively to ensure an effective level of service across the country. It will be untenable to be in a position where a force is left, or communities are left, without adequate and effective policing because we behave in a partial or defensive way.
Gentlemen, when you ask your question or make your comment, will you be kind enough to stand up and tell us who you are each time, no matter how many times you stand up? Yes, sir.
Alan Thomas from Gwent Police. Within Wales at the moment, we're obviously doing a lot of collaboration between and multiple different variety of forces. But I'm just wondering, particularly in the collaborations that you talked about there, what have been the main determining features as to whether something has been 2, 4 or 5 force? And how much of a role have PCCs played in either being 2 or 5?
I think the single biggest determinant has been our willingness as Chief Constables and as Chief Officers to agree that it will be done collaboratively. There are clearly issues that we have to work through with the police and crime commissioners, but the single strongest determinant is whether the Chief Constables have committed to it. I did a report in 2009 for the East Midlands on why collaboration hadn't worked, because if you remember, we were being encouraged to do this from 2005 when Charles Clarke said there's nothing mystical about the number 43, return to your forces and prepare to work differently. So we spent 5 years not moving forward, and the Chief Constables asked me to do a report saying why hadn't it worked, and there was a very, very simple reason why. No Chief Constable was prepared to compromise. Right. Everybody wanted to collaborate, providing everybody else did it their way.
How many other areas of England and Wales are there operating in the way that you are operating with the forces close to you?
Every part of the country is collaborating to an extent.
But to that extent?
How much and the extent to which they're doing it, Zoe is in a much better position to answer.
Oh, he knows I'm going to pile the praise onto him now, so he hands over to me. I think the East Midlands is ahead of the game in terms of regional collaboration, certainly through the ROCU and then building the major crime and all of the rest of the support functions.
Do you see the danger, though, the point I was alluding to, it may be rather simplistic, that great as this may sound and efficient as it may be and helpful to the taxpayers it may be, there is a danger that if other forces and other areas aren't so enthusiastic about this, you've got a two-tier police force?
I think that is a danger, and that's the reason why I've said in slightly veiled terms there needs to be a plan. I'm not talking about an individual plan for individual forces. There needs to be a plan that's a national plan that all forces are signed up to. And as Chris said very eloquently, we need to have a debate about whether or not there will be a minimum set of service standards that the public in every single place in England and Wales can expect.
Okay.
And that debate has not yet happened.
Thank you. We've got someone down there. Are you kind enough to stand up again and tell us who you are?
Good afternoon, I'm 2 minutes from South Yorkshire. Questions really directed, I guess, to both speakers today. I acknowledge the issue around local leadership and the need for us to model our service locally and collaborate in partnership. I guess with the continuing financial environment, my question really is, what's the role of HMIC, College of Policing and PCC in leading on delivering what we would want, which is a consistent, nationally modelled, statutory, threat, harm and risk-related offer of service to our communities? Because, as has been pointed out by the Chief, there is that risk that we're creating postcode lotteries. Locally on the ground, staff, again, are finding it more and more difficult to manage expectations within communities. And whilst we have that leadership responsibility locally, there seems to be an emerging debate. We've covered it now around the advisory groups around the policing mission. But I guess what I was asking today was, is a room there for those 3 agencies or departments or associations to actually work together and move to government and say, look, this is what our offer of service will be?
Zoe?
I think we all have distinct roles in that list, Tim, that you mentioned, College of Policing, MPCC and HMIC. Let me just deal with HMIC. I think we went some way last July in raising a warning flag, if you like, around the future of policing. And I think it's quite right that it's our role as the independent inspectorate to continue to raise that flag. So where we see things happening, which we've talked about publicly in the past, the erosion of neighbourhood policing, for example, the undue stress and strain that's being placed on public protection areas at the moment, whether that's domestic abuse or child protection, we have to raise that warning flag and we have to point to potential solutions. But I think it is for the leadership of the service, the NPCC, to come forward with more solutions than thus far have been forthcoming, and not to expect other organisations, and I know you're not suggesting this for 1 minute, but not suggest other organisations, be it the Home Office, the Home Secretary, the College of Policing or HMIC, to come up with those solutions for you. That's not our role.
In what you mentioned when you were talking to us all earlier about should we, in certain circumstances, be saying no, right? Mm-hmm. In what would make you say no? Well, if government came up with some scheme saying we want to do this, we want to do that, at which point and about what would you say no?
I have to be really careful as an independent inspectorate, John, and that's not to try to do, and despite my deepest desires to do so, is to attempt to do the job of a chief constable. I think it is a job for the service to say at what point enough is enough, and at what point the service to the public will be impacted by the cost reduction. So I'm going to pass this one over to Chris.
Let's ask the service. At what point would you say no?
I think we are at a point now where we're having to ask ourselves very clearly about all of the demand we face and the way we deliver all of our service. Which of this adds most value? We've seen some interesting debates play out during the summer, and I think what people have started doing, we've heard Peter Fahey talk about our role in relation to missing persons. Sarah talked about what do we do around non-dwelling burglaries, should we attend all non-dwelling burglaries. In Leicestershire, they've done a really cracking piece of evidence-based research looking in a randomised control trial about the value of crime scene investigators attending attempted burglaries. And what they found is you spend £50,000 in attending those burglaries before you get an identification. They did that in a way that mitigated the risk for the public and for the victim, so it was well done. So we've got to start asking ourselves now is it worthwhile spending £50,000 to get an ident from an attempted burglary? Is that the best investment we can make of that time, effort and energy and resource, particularly when for each one of those idents you need 10 of those before you get a charge on average? So you're spending £500,000 in that activity to achieve what outcome?
But given that of all the incidents you attend as a force in England and Wales, only around 20%, I think I'm right in saying, I think your figure said, are crime, right?
Yes.
I don't think the public understand that. I don't think they have any conception of that whatsoever. They think you're a coppers chasing burglars, full stop, end of story. They have no conception. How do you get that message across? And how do you actually possibly, in the new scheme of things, get rid of some of that? I mean, it's not your job half of this, is it? I mean, the welfare calls, the calls for dealing with people, with sad people, with poor people with mental health issues, that's not what you're trained for. That's not what you're there for. Is it?
The simple fact of the matter is I think some of the things where we debate around it is a question about how much of each organisation's role is in relation to vulnerability. If you look at things like missing children, where would we all feel on a child who's gone missing where there wasn't an appropriate response and they ultimately end up murdered? Mm. So the question about what we do and how much is our responsibility, how much is the responsibility of social care is a matter for debate. But Mike and others from Nottinghamshire, and I'm sure it's happening in every other force, they're working through at the moment, looking at the difficult things that we deal with every day and asking the question, how much of this do we have to do? How much of this should we do? How much of this is discretionary?
All right, gentleman at the back, then someone down here. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Andy Taylor from Cumbria Police. We've both talked about providing consistent levels of service across the service. PCCs are elected locally. What incentives do police and crime commissioners have for caring for all communities, not just local ones?
What incentives?
Yeah, what incentives do they have for caring for all communities rather than just their local ones?
I can be very clear about let's think about the debate we're having around a strategic alliance between Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire and Northamptonshire. The police and crime commissioners have been very clear They want to maximise the safety of services and the safety of their communities. They recognise that in order to do that, we've got to make sure that we're collectively as efficient as possible. Therefore, we will need to find a consistent way of working to make sure that with the scarce resource that's going to be there in the future, it's delivered in the most effective way. The incentive for them is if we don't do this, the level of cuts will have to be applied and it will necessarily be deeper and affect local services greater than if we're prepared to act in a more connected and joined up way.
Does that answer your question, sir? Back there, are you happy? I presume you are. Are you happy with that?
Not entirely, no.
Well, just wait till the mic comes back to you, sorry, and then we can hear you. Yeah, make your point, thank you.
I get it for your five-force alliance. I was just thinking back to this issue of differentiation. There's obviously been winners and losers over the last 5 years. You know, looking at the gold standard, some PCCs, and I think we'll be looking at whether or not it's in their interest to collaborate with forces that have got very challenging financial positions, because their ultimate responsibility is to the local electorate. And yes, I can see it for some commissioners. What I'm saying is that there are 42 commissioners, and not all of them might have the same sense of public service that you might be experiencing in your five-force alliance. I'm
going to be I'm going to do what comes very naturally to me. I'm going to be a very, very dull bureaucrat here, but you know, there is guidance. The guidance on collaboration published by the Home Office, which explains quite clearly what the duty on PCCs is, and it's not simply their duty to do what is in the best interest of policing in their local geographic area. It's also to act in a way that is in the interest of a broader area, whatever that area might be, undefined. And therefore, I think we need to ensure that we use whatever mechanisms we can to ensure that considerations around the greater good rather than the individual good are taken into account when decisions are made. Thank
you, Zoe. Got someone here. Again, stand up, sir, if you wouldn't tell everyone who you are.
Thank you, Matt Nichols from Hertfordshire. Just on the subject of PCCs, I wonder what level of risk there is next year as we move into PCC elections and PCC starting to promise the electorate things that can be done by the police at a time when we're trying to have a debate about what we're going to stop doing.
I guess there's a reality around it, which is, Matt, is it's what we're facing. I think overwhelmingly, and again, this is not going to be popular with some people in the service, that having a directly elected commissioner who's accountable to local communities is far and away positive. It means there is a direct connection, and when the conversation is taking place about the resource environment we're operating in, the public aren't daft. Let's look at some of the work HMIC has done with focus groups around the country. The public understand that in the context of very severe budget restraint, things have got to be done consistently. So yes, there's a challenge, and we're going to face a position undoubtedly across the country where new police and crime commissioners come in, and we're going to have to work very hard to make sure that we expose what we do, share, and are completely transparent with what's taking place, listen and understand their priorities, and are very clear about the realities we're facing.
Go on, sorry.
When PCCs were elected and we saw the demise of police authorities, it is a fact that in a number of force areas there was between 6 and in some places 18 months of what I would describe as planning blight. The police authority was not prepared to take major infrastructure type decisions for fear of being overstepping its authority in a sense and fettering the discretion of the incoming PCC. I think that the service needs to have the conversation with PCCs that at this moment in time, with the election scheduled when they are, there can't be another pause like the pause that we saw when PCCs came in for the very first time. And there has to be a brave approach taken by chief constables to ensure that decisions that need to be taken to achieve the cost reductions or changing in services necessary in the way that Chris has described, that those continue to be taken. We can't step away from the table and not have those discussions for 6, 12, possibly 18 months.
As a final, maybe a final question, possibly a final question. Chris, could I just ask you one thing? You mentioned the view in your need for the number of chief officers in England and Wales to be reduced, and you made note of the fact that they've only suffered a 10% reduction, whereas these guys have suffered, I think, 23% reduction. Have you had that conversation with your fellow chief officers? And I wonder if you have, what response you've got.
Well, let me give you the personal position. When I got to Nottinghamshire in 2010, there were 8 chief officers. There are now 3 of us. So I'm not saying something that I'm not living. The position that we take forward, I've taken it consistently at a regional level, and we are now in a position where we are rationalising the number of chief officers across the forces, and that's an active part of work that we're taking forwards. I think the reason things have been limited previously is that in order to operate as a single organisation, you need to have sufficient leadership in key positions to make it happen. And all the time that you've got 43 organisations, there's a necessary level that you get to in terms of chief officers. At last year's conference, Eyre made a statement in terms of the need for force mergers. I happened to be doing an interview with the media in the East Midlands that day, and they asked me the question what I thought about it. My response was not that there should be mergers, but I said there is no way that we should have 43 chief constables and 43 sets of headquarters.
So what do you get?
We need to be in a, I could give you a long personal view in terms of where it needs to be, but a rationalisation. I think we have to retain local democratic accountability. We have to have a rational management and operational structure that delivers beneath that. But I do not believe that we need 43 chief constables and 43 sets of headquarters. That does not mean that we couldn't have 43 identities of local delivery mechanisms, locally delivered structures across the country. But I do not understand why you'd need to have 43 sets of headquarters and 43 sets of chief constables above that.
And what's your response to those in this audience who might argue, and others in the police force service who might argue, that sharing resources means just simply means less for everybody?
Where we've brought together leadership, and it's probably happened more at the ranks represented in this room, but where we've put a single chief superintendent in charge of collaborative capability across different organisations, across different forces, they've delivered brilliantly because you've got a single coherent leadership set at the head of that organisation. So whether it be...
But have they delivered the resources? I mean, they might have delivered efficiency. Have they had the resources to do
yes.
the
But
job?
what they've done is they've been able to deliver more effectively because there's a single command structure that delivers across a broader area. So we made the savings and we have a better and more resilient delivery than existed before. I believe the same could happen at chief officer level as well.
Anyone got one burning question before we take a break? We haven't. In that case, would you show your appreciation to our speakers? Thank you both very much indeed.